So we have here today with us Professor Martha Reineke from University of Northern Iowa, who has agreed to kindly speak to us about Professor René Girard and how he had an impact on her and how she first met him. So let me start off by asking you, when did you first hear about Professor Girard?
Yes, well, that's a really good question. So I was starting out my career and I was part of a French reading group at my university where we were reading the most recent publications in post-structuralism. And one of the members of that group, who was a Fulbright scholar, said, based on what I was talking about, you need to read René Girard's The Scapegoat. So I did. And that was a transforming experience. I think maybe once every couple of years I read a book and on some page I just feel like the top of my head is exploding. It's just like boom. And that was one of those moments with The Scapegoat.
Why was it transformative?
Yeah. Well, I had been interested from the time I did my doctoral work with the problem of violence, and I was particularly interested in violence against women. And by the time I was in this reading group, I had taught for several years, and I had met women in my courses that had been really moved by their experience. One woman, I remember, she had bruises on her face that she was trying to cover up one night, and another woman had been emotionally abused by her husband. And I was just really struggling, like, how can I, with my work in existentialism phenomenology, how can I address this practical issue that to enhance my students' lives? Because my language for interacting with the world and for explaining it and trying to change it is an academic, it's a philosophical language. I'm not a social worker, right? So I was like, how can I make sense of this? Right. And what I learned from my doctoral work, where I was really reading some of the preliminary works in the feminist canon, specifically Simone de Beauvoir, I had learned that the problem of bias against women or bias based on race is difference. So that there's in the case of men and women, there's a masculine norm, and anything that deviates from that norm is considered deficient, just sort of by definition. And with race, that whatever was white was valued and the negative leftovers were assigned to persons of color. And it was almost as if you divide up the turf, you take what you want, and everything else that's different from that is a negative. So that was the theory I'd been working on.
Right.
But the solutions, that's the description, and the solutions that were offered were from a variety of perspectives. Well, it's economic inequality that has led to problems that women have experienced, or is discrepancies, inadequacies in child rearing, are all things that could be fixed, right? You change how the economy works, or you change how families are organized, you change this, you change that, and the problem goes away. But it seemed to me that violence was much more systemic. There was something about violence that was unreasonable, right? So I'm juggling all of these things and I'm making no progress on them. And then I read The Scapegoat, and it's only about 30 pages in, and René Girard says, the problem with violence is not difference. It's that there's not enough difference. And his example was disability, so that the person who has a physical disability, which are the noticeable disabilities, is viewed problematically, and in myth and literature, the person who's disabled is often under suspicion of some kind of monstrousness.
Right.
So the problem, Girard says, is not that the disabled person is unlike us and is set apart from whoever is able-bodied by their difference, but they are not different enough. And the less difference they show, the more we realize we could be them. And so the failure of boundaries, the collapse of boundaries, where one person doesn't know where they start and the other person stop and the other person starts, that was the problem. And that was incredibly illuminating to me. That was the top of my head exploding, because it had never occurred to me that the dynamism that was making persons uncomfortable was one of people coming closer together and finding that closeness threatening, as opposed to we'll put everything over here that's different and we'll dump on that. And so that helped me understand actually domestic violence. That domestic violence happens when a couple one of them perceives the other as so close to them as to become threatening, that their boundaries are going to be violated. And what happens is they feel an inadequacy in some way. So whatever their inadequacy is, their lack of being, which was another phrase I got from Girard, that we feel that we lack being and we seek it in another. And so many couples talk very positively about finding completion in their partner, right? So that's not necessarily pathological. We say, oh, we complement each other, that sort of thing. You have this and it fills in a gap in my own existence. But when that person who's supposed to fill in that gap in being actually becomes close to you in a pathological situation, that person, instead of being reassuring to you, becomes a source of threat. And so once I got that equation, everything changed. And I found that explains why violence is not easily resolved, why there's a ratcheting up of conflict to the point of violence, why also it helped me understand violence is not necessarily a speedy thing where somebody gets overwhelmed with anger and then they just lose control. Because in torture, violence is done slowly. And so the idea that you are invaded and you have to stop that invasion in a very deliberate manner also helped me to understand different expressions of physical violence.
So when did you meet Professor Girard first?
Well, I am not really sure. I started going to the Colloquium on Violence and Religion meetings. And at one of the, he went to all of them, right? And so I associated each summer I would go to a cover meeting and he would be there. And he would be participating in conversation and meals. And so I would be sitting we would all eat together and I'd be sitting at the dinner table. He'd be there, he'd be in the lectures, and sometimes he spoke. Though the first time, the first memory I have of him specifically was when he was at a conference, I think it was at Purdue, and he was engaged in a dialogue with a scholar, Bruce Chilton, who's a biblical scholar who works with the early Common Era materials. And he and Girard engaged in a multi-day dialogue. And that, to me, was an incredible model of how scholars can talk with each other, learn from each other, disagree with each other, and yet be supportive of each other's particular ways of seeing the world. And I think that is a testimony to mimetic theory at its best, that when imitation of others, so scholarly imitation, can be conflicted, so there can be a competition among scholars. But Girard showed what we like to call positive mimesis, where he and Chilton were appreciative of each other's perspectives. And so that became a defining moment for me in thinking about Girard as a scholarly role model, is how he talked with other scholars.
Right. And how did he have an impact on your own work and your own research?
Yes, well, that's a really good question. So the other thing that happened when I was in that French reading group, the same person who told me to read The Scapegoat also told me to read Julia Kristeva. And she had published around the same time Powers of Horror, which was a view of how violence is caught up with fears of pollution. And I was very much interested in the embodiment of the threatening similarity. And while Girard addresses that threat where the closeness becomes monstrous and about the physicality of monstrousness,
Yes.
his theory of violence, he doesn't spend a lot of time discussing that. So I was interested in how she addressed the physicality of violence, particularly coming out of pollution, because pollution is seepage. It's where that closeness becomes really messy. So when we think about pollution, it's by definition uncontrollable. It's something seeping under the door, coming through the air, and it doesn't observe boundaries. So it's a particular kind of problem. And so I was interested in that, and it spoke to a gap in his work. And then I was very much interested that her theory said that the initial work we do with boundary creation of how we are both similar and different from each other is in early childhood. And Girard doesn't think very much interesting happens until humans have language, symbols, and rituals. Whereas Kristeva, following Freud, one of the first stories that she talks about is the Freud, the Fort da game, where Freud's grandson Ernst is playing a game. He barely has language and his mother has left, and he's throwing a reel toward and away from him and saying Fort and da. And Girard actually talks about this game. It's a very famous example in psychoanalysis of various kinds of things. What Kristeva talks about is that this child who's barely learning language is, the words aren't as important as the fact that he is dealing with the separation from his mother, with biting her off with the words of his minimal vocabulary, that there was something physical in his managing of her separation, his separation from her. So that became an interest to me. And so what I often say is that if Kristeva and Girard had had a conversation together about her interest in his work, because she followed his work for many, many years and cites his work regularly in hers, even in her novels. He's alluded to his non-sacrificial Christology. If they had had a conversation, which at one time seemed possible, he heard her as a grad student when she was in a graduate program in France. He invited her to come to Johns Hopkins as a visiting professor. And if she had gone, my career would not have been necessary, because I think they would have connected and she would have influenced him just the way he influenced her.
Right.
And some of the things that are missing in his work that I think would enhance his work had he looked into them, he could have appreciated just the way he was influenced by so many of his students. So he was so influenced by Sandy Goodhart, for example, that the kind of early thoughts he had about Christian exceptionalism, he really recast those views over the years of dialogue with Sandy Goodhart, and saw in the prophetic message of the Hebrew Bible the anticipation of the anti-sacrificial narrative of the New Testament, and saw them as aligned. And I think the gaps in his thinking about the role of sexual difference in violence, he would have been able to revise his views over time.
Right.
Because one of the things he did in Violence in the Sacred, he talks about there being two kinds of blood, that there's the blood of sacrifice and then there's the blood of pollution. So in the first 50 pages of Violence in the Sacred, he has the poles that come from Freud, totem and taboo.
Right.
And he collapses the polluting blood into the violent blood. And he actually does that collapse thinking about pollution associated with women's bodies. And then he never looks back. Well, the positive thing about never looking back is that he's able to move in extremely novel directions. He's no longer in the shadow of Freud. He's doing work that Freud didn't do, particularly looking at the macro scale of societal violence, the anthropology of violence in a way that is absolutely unique, transformative, and why he is such an important thinker. But there was a cost in that, and the cost was that when he dropped that attention to polluting blood, to forms of death that are associated with mortality, to elements of sensory experience that are associated with disgust as opposed to anger or outrage, there's a strand of thought that went missing. And Christopher is one of the scholars who pursued that line of thought. And then because she did, my conversation with him over so many years has been to draw out those themes, to strengthen his work by filling in what I have noticed to be silences. That when you have a question, he doesn't have an answer. And so it's like, well, if I can help with providing some further attention to questions he dropped and possible answers, then his work becomes stronger, because we walk away from theories when we ask them questions and they don't provide answers.
Right.
And we stick with them. The more answers they provide to questions we have, we go, all right, this is helping me to make sense of my world.
You're right now the president of a cover, Colloquium on Violence and Religion. So how do you foresee the future of cover going?
Well, that's a great question. I am very excited about the future. So one of the things that has happened in the last decade with academic organizations, or primarily academic organizations, is that with the change over what we call the development of the corporate university, using part-time labor, et cetera, that the professoriate, the academy, is shrinking in size. So there are fewer persons to have conversations with in an academic organization. At the same time, mimetic theory has been increasingly turned to by persons who aren't academics for resolving issues. So for example, Duncan Morrow is a mimetic theorist, but he also works in an applied context with violence in Ireland, the Northern Ireland and Ireland, the Protestant Catholic conflict. And he works in a local setting with workshops to help persons think mimetically about a very practical problem. And there are other persons who are working outside the academy. So Cover has always welcomed what we call practitioners of mimetic theory, persons who aren't in the academy but use mimetic theory in their daily life, whether they are engaged in work with community organizations or communities of faith, secular or religious. And I see the great growth in our organization with that. We're really reaching out to build those relationships. The other thing I'm excited about is not every academic organization is transitioning to the digital world that we are moving ever more quickly into, and the pandemic has ratcheted up. Some of us were already out on digital platforms. We were on Twitter, we were on Facebook, we were on Instagram, we were this, that, and the other thing. We were doing podcasts, we had YouTube channels. But the pandemic has really speeded that up and also enabled us to see we're never going to go back exactly to the way we were in many respects. One of them is we're going to be ever more attached to communicating globally on these digital platforms. And I think Cover is very well positioned as a global organization with a number of partner organizations that are situated around the world to embrace the distribution of mimetic theory on digital platforms, and therefore to start conversations with persons in a variety of forums that are, again, not related to the university, not strictly confined to the university. So some academic organizations are not making either of those switches. So they've declined in membership because there are fewer persons who are full-time academics and therefore can be part of a professional organization. And they haven't ventured digitally. I mean, they may have a website, but it's like nobody ever goes to the website, right? So I think that we are doing in those two ways. We're still very supportive of traditional research, and some of our partner organizations really emphasize publication of monographs and academic conferences, etc. So we're not giving that up, but we're going to be like the three-legged stool, right? We've got the traditional academic scholarship, monographs, scholarly conferences, the world of practitioners of mimetic theory, which I think Girard would love. I mean, he didn't see his theory as something that was like a hothouse plant, right? It was out there to answer questions in the world. And then we've got the third leg, which is the digital platform for sharing all of this. And the key we need, if we're going to do that, we have to have a lot of young members who are in all three of those locations, right? So that otherwise the stool is going to get, we all have, well, maybe not all of us. I have furniture that's old and the glue is coming loose.
Right.
And I pick up a chair and the leg falls off. So you need youth, you need to have the next generation
New
coming
blood.
along.
No pun
Right,
intended.
and we do.
Right.
So our three-legged stool is very healthy at this point.
Excellent.
Yeah.
How many members do you have at Cover?
Well, we have, this year we have 350. It's down a little because due to the pandemic, we weren't able to have our annual conference. And usually for the conference, we gain about 50 members who have not heard of us before or who sign up because their membership has lagged and they realize,
Sure.
oh, I want to participate in the conference. So, so we're between 350 and 400 at this point.
I saw on your website it's going to be done next year. This year's conference is going to be at Purdue. Is going to be done next year.
Right. And the topic, artificial intelligence, we had a fantastic conference planned. So we are just holding it.
Right.
And we'll do it next year.
Okay. Right. Was there a specific memory you have of René Girard that you'd like to share with us?
So one of my favorite memories is, I think from the mid-2000s, I was out at Stanford for a mimetic theory meeting, and I was invited to come a day early because there was a seminar going on that was eventually going to become the Mimesis in Science book. And I was able to sit in on the seminar. So the seminar consisted of persons who were in neurobiology, neurosciences, developmental psychology. Urgulian was there, psychiatry being represented there. Dupuy was there. All the people who have chapters in the Mimesis in Science book. And Girard, of course, was there. And it was a very small group. We were sitting around a table and for a day and a half of conversation, and they were presenting their preliminary ideas for this, what was going to become this book. And as you know, in the US, we have very narrow disciplinary boundaries of what a natural scientist is as opposed to a social scientist or a humanities person. So all these folks were certifiably in the natural sciences, medicine, biology, neuroscience, etc. And so Girard, he was just sitting off like 3 people away from me, and I was able to, at this big square of a table, and I was able to look at his face as these people presented. And that's what I recall, is that on his face was this look of great appreciation and pleasure that scientists, persons in all these very quantitative fields, whether they're working with mirror neurons or doing, that's often developmental psychology has a lab, everything goes in a lab. These laboratory scientists were engaging mimetic theory in a very intentional and dynamic and fully committed way. And Girard had always said that his mimetic theory is a science, right? And he wanted it to be appreciated as having the kind of discipline and systematic aspect, and also the hypothetical aspect of things needing to be tested. He'd always wanted mimetic theory to be perceived in that way. And so that's what I saw in his face, that his work was being received in the way he had always offered it, but in ways which it was not always received when persons would try to slot it into, oh, it's humanities, it's not empirical, it's not testable.
Sure.
And it was a real privilege to be in that room, for one thing, to hear all of these folks in the construction of the arguments that were eventually going to become Mimesis, the book Mimesis in Science, but also to see Girard in that, what was a unique moment, because I think that's probably the only time he's been in a room where in the majority there were scientists in that room.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it was beautiful, and I think I'm so glad he had that opportunity, that book was done at a time when he could still participate in and be in the room and hear that kind of reflection on it, his work. I think he found it very gratifying.
It was really amazing because he started off, as you pointed out, with Deceit, Desire, and the novel, which was really literature.
Right.
You would never have thought
Right.
it would go all the way into humanities, from humanities into sciences.
Right.
And as you pointed out, evolution and conversion touched upon it as well. It
Right.
really got into even...
Yes, I think evolution and conversion, yes, he really does draw that thread of science. And I think what it tells us too, it tells us a lot about him and his goals for mimetic theory, but it also tells us that when the natural sciences are confined to a box, as if it has to be doing empirical work, means you never touch on something that would also be of interest to a humanist, you're not doing good science.
Right.
And these people were very high powered in their fields. I mean, if you just have to look at the contributors to that book, and they know that those boxes, those boundaries, those silos make no sense. That really creative scholarship, ground moving scholarship, whether it's whatever disciplinary niche it is in a university or in a department of medicine or whatever, that those boundaries don't work. And that we all, to do creative work, we talk to people who aren't in the same silo. And then eventually those silos break down. And I think that's one reason why mimetic theory is going to last as such a powerful resource for people, is it was never confined to those silos. And that book is a very powerful demonstration of how it can impact persons in, like, what field doesn't it impact persons in, right?
What's your own research right now?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I had spent so many years working on Girard and the question of violence that I became interested in a little relief from that. It's when you're always working with violence and trauma, it's even if you've been blessed and it's not in your own life, it wears on one. And so one of the things I became interested in as a result of doing this research, one of the things I noticed is that Girard, in his early work, meaning Deceit, Desire, and the novel, and also From the Underground, is it?
Notes from the Underground.
Notes, I was going, messages, no, what is it? Notes from the Underground. He was so much influenced by the existentialists. And in fact, in Evolution and Conversion, he says something about looking back, he'd forgotten how influenced he was by the existentialists. So that's been one of my areas of interest, because the existentialists, particularly Merleau-Ponty, developed a philosophy of embodiment that I think is very helpful to mimetic theory. So I found myself going back and tracing his steps when he was in his early work, where he was influenced more by Sartre particularly, but also by Merleau-Ponty, but Sartre gets more face time, so to speak, we would say today. So I went back and started working with that. And then I became interested as I followed that thread through his work. And again, it was good that it's just like Freud. It was good that he dropped these folks, because he came into his own voice through doing it. But there was a cost, and the cost once again was not attending, as with dropping Freud, he didn't attend enough to the negative aspects of the body. So pollution, the kind of interiorized violence that is associated with a kind of implosion or the disgust rather than the aggression, right? So that he did totem but not taboo. And then giving up the existentialist, he gave up the erotic, the positive aspect of body relationships. So that's what I've been working with. I've been working with a mimetic theory of the erotic, and it has several components, one of which is he was very much influenced by Denis de Rougemont, who had a very popular book in the late 1940s, published in English when Girard was in grad school, very influential. And he had, he viewed that there was a vertical, the love had a vertical component of agape, but it had a debilitating component that was eros. And so even in marriage, the best model of love is that of the mystics, who had no marital love with humans, right? So I've been tracing, where could we get a positive mimesis, where could we get a positive view of the erotic by working on Girard? And so that's going in a couple of directions. I've been working with the de Rougemont part and tracing that through, and the work that that Girard did in Deceit, Desire, and the Novel with that. But I'm engaged in a multi-step project on Teresa of Avila.
Oh,
because
fantastic.
she's represented as a model, but that's only because
Does Girard ever talk about Teresa Avila?
Yes, yeah, very, very briefly, because Rougemont does.
I see.
So it's very brief. It's just he basically, in my reading of Girard, he takes up the Rougemont thesis rather uncritically.
I see.
And then again, it's somewhat like what he does with Freud. He just sort of drops the topic. When he drops the existentialists and he drops de Rougemont, he goes on to his thing, and he does not return to the discussion of eros and embodiment. So in Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, you can see that he's following Sartre's discussion of in Being and Nothingness of the erotic, page by page. You can hold Being and Nothingness in one hand and Deceit, Desire, and the Novel in the other, and you can follow along. Of course, Girard doesn't always mention that he's reading Sartre, but that's the same thing. Merleau-Ponty wrote The Phenomenology of Perception, and never tells us who he's arguing with. You have to know, oh, he's talking to Heidegger. Oh, he's talking to Sartre. Oh, he's talking to Husserl. You have to know this, because he figures, I don't need to tell you who these folks are. You don't know them, then you shouldn't be reading me. Right. So the interest in Teresa, which he vaguely mentions, is that she had so much an embodied theology, and an erotic in a very positive sense. And there's been an ambivalence about that. There's been efforts to, after the fact, to obfuscate that, to say, oh, well, she, the same way that's done with Song of Songs and Song of Solomon. Oh, well, there's all these metaphors. Well, no. I mean, I think we need to look very directly. And so I'm working on like 3 papers at once on Teresa, one of which is to look at her Jewish background, because she came from a Jewish family, and Judaism has been much more affirming of, we would call it a positive theology of sexuality. And I think that influenced her mysticism in a way that, I don't just think that, there's a literature out there. So there's a literature on her theology, on the erotic aspects of it, that I'm trying to bring into conversation with Girard. And that will take me a while.
Oh, it sounds fantastic. It's fascinating. It's quite brand new.
Yeah, well, the thing that I find so interesting about Girard, and I suppose this happens to any scholar who finds someone such a rich source that they just never are done with that person, right?
Yes.
And so Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, which was the formative book for Girard's theory, it's like, I can't get out of that book. There's always something new in it that leads me into new directions.
It's very rich.
And, oh, it's just incredible. It's one of the most important books published in the 20th century, and it's understated in the sense that at some point you could think, oh, he's just talking about a series of novels, but he's not. He's laying out his entire mimetic theory that's going to take him the rest of his career to parse. But it's all there, and it's there in such a rich way that, I think it's about 307 pages or something. It's 200. It's like hundreds of pages, but every page you could spend. You could spend for, and that's what an important book is. That's what we say. Important books are books you never finish. Absolutely. They're always new. Every time you open them, there's like, wow. And that's that. I mean, of all his books, that's the one that I have found most. It's just mesmerizing. It's new every time I open it.
That's phenomenal. That's interesting. What about the things hidden since the foundation of the world? We never talked about that.
Yes, well, I use that because that's where you get, when you want to do I do close reading, right? And so when I want to ask myself, where did he go with this idea? What precisely was he trying to say? And the interlocutor style of it, where he's asked a precise question and then he's able to answer it precisely. That's where I go when I'm building up the argument, right? So I set it out, my conversation with Girard in using Violence of the Sacred or Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, or something else. And then when I go, well, when did he get down in the weeds on this particular question?
Right.
And that's what Things Hidden is really, it's unequal. Though I must say Evolution and Conversion is an extremely helpful book too, because that's where he goes back. Again, it's the conversational tone, but it's not the weeds, it's the distilled essence of him looking back on his career.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. But his last book was really a controversial book. Came out of nowhere.
Right.
And he was going to write a book on St. Paul on that last I spoke to him, and then it turned out to be Battling to the End. So that's a. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I did one paper on Battling to the End, and I think the positive aspect of that book is that he discusses in more detail than in any other context what he takes to be positive mimesis or intimate mediation. And so there's information there and insights. And I think that there's scholarship that has come out, not by me, but in process. It was actually some that hasn't been published yet that I've been reading. I read a lot of manuscripts for presses, so there's stuff I can't say yet, but there's some interesting work coming out that really illuminates some of the more, not just positive features of battling to the end, but draws out by connecting some of his thoughts there to some features of his work that have been neglected elsewhere, that really even makes even more clear how helpful those comments are on the holy as opposed to the sacred.
Right.
But my issue with Battling to the End, and again, it's a rich book. There's so much in it on violence and on how Christianity and the overcoming of this the exposure of the sacrificial mechanism has not had the positive consequences Girard anticipated in his early reflections on it.
Yeah.
You're right. So the apocalyptic perspective. But what I wanted to look at was Hölderlin and how the place of positive mimesis is modeled on someone who turned away from the world to commune with, in the Christian sense, Christ with the Father. And to me, there's a loss there of a confidence in the prophetic message of the Hebrew Bible, and then followed up in the teachings and the healing ministry of Jesus, that I was not comfortable with that. And so I wrote a bit about that in a paper. But I don't think, my sense is that when someone ends, or one of their final statements is an apocalyptic message, my sense is, if we take that in the context of everything Girard wrote, he never argued to claim his theory. I heard him say, I heard him 15, 20 times, test my theory. If it doesn't work, I'll be the first to give it up, right? So if we are, I'm not comfortable with this apocalyptic take on the world, well, he's not going to hit us over the head with it. He's going to say, if you're uncomfortable with it, figure out why you're uncomfortable and offer something else. I think that's a characteristic of scholarly excellence. So my daughter is in the field of medicine, and she was actually just talking yesterday. She has been doing interviews for fellowships, and she says she has met some very well-known people in the field of medicine, and she said, if I hadn't read about them, I wouldn't have a clue, because the strongest intellects have the least ego. If you don't have confidence in your scholarship, you're protective of it, right? If you're personally invested in its success, you are going to put up blocks that are going to stop the ongoing movement of your work, and it's not going to have the influence. Right. So outstanding scholarship is egoless scholarship, whether it's in medicine or if it's in humanities or if it's in biological sciences. And so I think Girard is absolutely representative of the best in scholarship. He's not protective of his work. It's a hypothesis. Play with it, see what happens with it. And if it doesn't work, then I'm not going to insist that you keep it. That was not the point of throwing it out there. And that's so good for anyone who comes to mimetic theory, to know that that is not only his model, but it's how he modeled scholarship for others, so that persons the generations of scholars, including you, who were influenced by his work, had a model of generosity that has enabled mimetic theory to evolve and to look at new things, and to never feel that, I mean, there are characteristics of, you need to be careful, you need to read carefully, you need to justify your arguments. There's all the mechanics of argumentation. But in terms of ever being told, oh, don't go there.
Yes.
There's none of that.
None of that. Absolutely. No. He was very, very open and encouraging and supportive all the way. Right. Thank you so much, and looking forward to meeting you after this pandemic is over. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about your thoughts and memories of Professor.
Well, this was fun. I really appreciated the opportunity, so thank you very much. I appreciate it.